All right, so get this. We're diving into some pretty major breaking news today. Stuff that could completely shake up the American education system. I mean, who knows? Maybe as we know it. President Trump just announced that he wants to completely abolish the U.S. Department of Education.
Wow.
So we're here to unpack what that actually means, for students, for teachers, for parents, for really everyone.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to have a ripple effect, I think, across the country.
For sure. And we're basing our deep dive today on a couple of really interesting reports, some fresh reporting from Reuters and the Associated Press, both covering this pretty shocking announcement. And it's a big deal, no doubt about it. This could impact everything. I mean, everything. From kindergarten classrooms to college lecture halls, student loans.
Yeah. Student debt.
The whole 9 yards.
It's interesting, though, because this isn't a brand new stance for President Trump.
Right.
He's actually been calling for, the elimination of the department since, way back in his first term in 2017. He even called it a big con job at one point.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But this time it feels different, right? He's really pushing for immediate closure, even though he knows that getting Congress and all those teachers' unions on board,
Oh, yeah.
not going to be easy. And there's even talk that Trump, working with, his advisor Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency,
Oh, wow.
is actually ready to just start making cuts, even without waiting for Congress to give him the green light.
That raises a really important question then about, the power of an executive order.
Yeah.
How far can that actually go?
Yeah.
Can he really just dismantle an institution like the Department of Education, which has been around for so long without facing some pretty serious legal challenges?
Right.
It would be unprecedented, really.
Yeah.
And the implications for the balance of power.
Huge.
Huge.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a minute and try to wrap our heads around this. We're talking about trying to coordinate education for over 50 million students across all 50 states. Public schools, private schools, trillions of dollars in student loans.
It's a lot.
The whole shebang, that's what we're talking about dismantling here.
Yeah, and it's not just about the logistics of it all, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Department of Education also plays a really crucial role in setting those national education standards, making sure that there's equitable access for students across the country,
Right.
and protecting civil rights within the education system. I mean, that's huge.
So when we talk about funding, these reports are suggesting that this move could really disrupt tens of billions of dollars in aid to K-12 schools and colleges, programs like Title I, which provides crucial support to schools in low-income areas,
Right.
special needs education funding, arts programs, school infrastructure upgrades.
Yeah.
They could all be on the chopping block.
Title I is a big one.
Yeah.
Because it's specifically designed to kind of even the playing field, right? For students from disadvantaged backgrounds, making sure they have access to the same quality of education as their, wealthier peers, abolishing the Department of Education could create a situation where these essential programs are left in limbo, potentially making existing inequalities in education even worse.
Absolutely. And then there's the elephant in the room, right? Student loans.
Oh, yeah.
The Department of Education manages, get this, $1.5 trillion
Oh, wow.
in student loan debt for over 40 million borrowers. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine what that would do to loan forgiveness programs, right? And the logistical nightmare of transferring that massive responsibility.
Yeah, to another agency.
I mean, where would it even go?
Right. Where would it even go?
It's crazy.
And think about all the borrowers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so many of them are already struggling to make their payments. A sudden change like that in how their student loans are being managed could cause so much uncertainty and anxiety. I mean, it's a lot for millions of Americans to deal with. It's crucial to consider that, the human impact, right alongside the financial and logistical challenges.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another really crucial aspect, the whole issue of civil rights enforcement. The Department of Education plays a huge role in investigating discrimination in schools, particularly issues that are affecting LGBTQ+ students and students of color.
Right, and that's where the Office for Civil Rights within the department comes in. They're the ones who make sure schools were actually following those federal civil rights laws, working to create a more equitable learning environment for all students. But under Trump, we've actually seen a shift in priorities, haven't we? More focus on complaints of anti-Semitism and investigating transgender athletes' participation in school sports.
That's right. So it seems like the Trump administration's vision for the role of the department, it's different. It's different from what we saw under the previous Biden administration. A perfect example of that, I think, is this back and forth over student loan forgiveness. Biden made it a big part of his agenda, forgiving billions in debt,
You did.
but Trump calls those programs a catastrophe unfair to those who already paid off their loans.
Yeah. It's a real clash of viewpoints, and I think it highlights a much broader debate
Mm,
about the role of government in education.
yeah.
It's not just about the funding or even the logistics. It's about fundamental values
Yeah.
and, differing ideologies.
Totally. And those ideological differences become even more apparent when we look at Trump's stance on accreditation.
Right.
He said that he wants to replace what he calls radical left accreditors with ones that prioritize defending the American tradition.
Now, the accreditation process historically has been designed to maintain some consistency in educational quality across different institutions,
Okay.
right? And protect them from, well, political influence. But Trump's approach seems to link funding to institutions that adhere to a specific ideology, which is kind of...
Yeah, I mean, he's been very critical of diversity and equity programs and has proposed rewarding states that end teacher tenure
Yeah.
and embrace, school choice initiatives like charter schools and vouchers.
If you had to, boil down Trump's vision, it seems like he really wants to significantly reduce the role of the federal government in education, give states more control.
Yeah.
You see that especially in his plan to shift responsibility for programs like Title Y and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to state governments.
And those are big ones. Those programs are essential safety nets for so many low-income schools and for students with disabilities.
Yeah.
Transferring that responsibility to the states could have a huge impact on some of the most vulnerable student populations in the country. I mean, we've even seen proposals from conservative think tanks,
Oh, really?
like the Heritage Foundation, to completely eliminate those programs and replace them with block grants to states, which would fundamentally change how education is funded in the U.S.
Wow, that's fascinating. And think about the potential ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to say what would happen. Would states actually prioritize those programs the same way the federal government has? Would we see consistent funding across different states, ensuring that all students, regardless of where they live, are getting adequate support? These are huge, complex questions with no easy answers.
That's the truth. This whole situation raises so many questions: political maneuvering, funding debates, clashing ideologies, and potentially millions of students whose lives are going to be directly affected by these decisions. I mean, where do you even begin to unravel something this complex?
Well, if you were tasked with actually dismantling the Department of Education, I think the first thing you'd have to figure out is how to transfer all those responsibilities,
Yep.
right? In a way that minimizes the disruption to schools and students. You'd have to establish those clear lines of authority, make sure there's a smooth transition of funding, and you'd have to address concerns about potential gaps in services.
Yeah, it sounds like a massive, massive undertaking with a lot of room for confusion and, well, probably some unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And we haven't even started talking about the legal battles that could come up, right?
Oh, right.
I mean, any attempt to eliminate a cabinet-level department, that's going to be met with lawsuits from all sorts of groups, potentially delaying the whole thing for years.
Yeah,
And we need to consider the people, too.
right.
4,400 employees at the department. What happens to their jobs? Do they get absorbed into other agencies? Or are they left unemployed?
It's a lot.
I mean, these are real
Yeah.
concerns.
It really is. It seems like with every layer of the story that we peel back, we just find more and more complexity and potential challenges. It's kind of overwhelming, to be honest. What, to you, stands out as the most crucial part in all of this?
I keep coming back to the potential impact on equity
Yeah.
and access to quality education.
Yeah.
For all students. I mean, if the Department of Education is abolished, there needs to be clear safeguards
Right.
to make sure that all students, no matter their background or circumstances, can get a high-quality education.
Right. We can't forget about the students. This is all about making sure that every child has the chance to reach their full potential. Which brings us to a huge question. I mean, if this does happen, what happens next?
And that brings up another big question. I mean, if the Department of Education were to be dismantled, how would we ensure consistent educational standards across all 50 states? I mean, would we see a sort of return to a more fragmented system where, the quality of education and the opportunities available to students would vary so much depending on where they live?
That's a huge question. And it really gets to the core of this whole debate about federal versus state control when it comes to education. I mean, we've heard from those who support getting rid of the department saying that states are actually in a better position, better equipped to really meet the unique needs of their students. which could lead to more, like, innovation and flexibility at a local level.
That's one side of the coin, for sure. But you also have, the folks who support the Department of Education.
Mm.
And they argue that a strong federal role is crucial,
Yeah.
absolutely essential to guaranteeing that all students, no matter where they live, no matter their zip code, have access to a quality education. They often point to, the historical role that the federal government has played in, like,
Yeah.
desegregating schools,
Sure.
right, and enforcing those civil rights protections as proof that it's really important.
So it seems like we're looking at two totally different visions for the future of American education. One where local control is the driving force, right? And another where the federal government takes a more active role, setting standards and making sure there's equity across the board. It's an interesting tension, to say the least.
And it's not a new debate either. I mean, this has
Yeah.
been going on for decades, really reflecting those very deep-seated ideological differences about the role government should play in society. And I think the important thing to remember here is that both sides truly believe that they are doing what's best for students, even if their approaches are, well, fundamentally different.
One thing that really stands out to me, and this is where it gets even more interesting, is how these reports are highlighting Trump's intention to use, well, federal funding as leverage to really push his vision for education forward. He's saying that he wants to cut off funds for schools and colleges that are promoting, in his words, critical race theory, transgender insanity, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content. And then on the flip side, he wants to reward those states and schools that get rid of things like teacher tenure and embrace those school choice programs, charter schools, vouchers, that kind of thing.
You've hit on a really important point. What this suggests is that even if the Department of Education were to be abolished, the federal government could still wield a lot of power. I mean, a lot of influence over education policy just through its ability to, allocate funding or withhold it. And this raises some big questions, like who gets to decide what is considered appropriate content, and how would those decisions impact academic freedom and, the diversity of thought and different viewpoints within the education system.
It's sort of like what we're seeing play out with this whole debate about woke content in schools. You have those conservative groups that are really pushing for more control over the curriculum, targeting anything they consider to be, too liberal or progressive. But then you have a lot of educators and civil rights advocates who are pushing back, saying that these efforts are basically attempts to censor certain points of view and, limit students' exposure to a broader range of ideas.
This is a very complex issue, and it's probably going to become even more, well, heated as the political climate in this country gets even more polarized. It's crucial, I think, for all of us to engage in these debates thoughtfully with nuance, recognizing that there are actually valid concerns on both sides.
I couldn't agree more. We can't allow ourselves to fall into those traps, those easy answers or those simplistic solutions. I mean, the future of education for millions and millions of young people is on the line here, and it deserves our full attention and our, most critical thinking. So let's imagine for a second that the Department of Education is actually abolished. What would need to happen to ensure that there's a smooth transition and, the concerns of both sides? Those who support it, those who are against it are addressed.
That's the question, isn't it? Okay, so first things first. I think you would absolutely need a very clear, transparent plan for transferring all of those responsibilities. And we know there are a lot of them, from the Department of Education to either other agencies or to the states. And you'd have to do this in a way that creates minimal disruption to schools and teachers and students, right? You'd have to have those really clear lines of authority, a guarantee of a smooth transition of funding, and really proactively address all those concerns about gaps in services.
So we're talking about a massive bureaucratic undertaking with huge potential for things to fall through the cracks. And who knows what kind of unintended consequences might come up.
For sure. And, we haven't even touched on the potential legal challenges that could come up. I mean, anytime you try to abolish a cabinet-level department, you're almost guaranteed to face a bunch of lawsuits from all kinds of different groups, which could delay the process, for years.
And what about all the people who work for the Department of Education? The 4,400 employees. What happens to their jobs if the department is gone? Do they get moved to different agencies or do they end up unemployed?
That's another crucial piece of the puzzle. We have to keep in mind that these policy decisions affect real people. And we need to make sure that we're taking into account the needs of all the stakeholders involved.
It's so true. It seems like the more we dig into this, the more complex it gets. Every layer we peel back just reveals even more challenges. This is a real deep dive in every sense of the word. So Given all of this, I mean, what are your thoughts on how this might actually play out in the months and years ahead?
It's tough to say for sure, There are so many moving parts. The political landscape is constantly shifting. There's the potential for legal challenges. And then, of course, there's public opinion, which is hard to predict. But one thing is clear. This issue isn't just going to disappear. This debate goes straight to the core of who we are as a society and what we believe about the role of education in shaping our future.
And it's a debate that deserves our attention. We can't let sound bites and partisan rhetoric determine how education is going to work in this country. We need a real, in-depth conversation about what kind of education system we want for our kids and for future generations.
You're absolutely right. We're at a turning point, a crossroads.
Yeah.
And the decisions we make now are going to have a huge impact, lasting consequences.
So as we continue this deep dive, it's important to remember that this isn't just about politics, right? Or about ideology. It's about real people, real students, their hopes and dreams for the future.
I love that. It's about making sure every single student has the chance to reach their full potential and to contribute to a better, more just and equitable world.
And before we move on, I just want to reiterate that we're not taking sides here. We're just trying to present the information, as objectively as we can so you can form your own opinion. We've talked a lot about the potential challenges of, getting rid of the Department of Education, but what if we look at it from a different angle? What if we explore the history of the department and, how it even came to be in the first place?
That's a great idea. Looking back at the historical context can often shed some light on, current debates and help us understand how we got to this point. The fact that the Department of Education wasn't established until, well, relatively recently, 1979, is something that people often forget. It's a pretty young institution compared to a lot of other branches of the federal government.
So before 1979, how was education even handled in the U.S.? It's hard to imagine, a time before the Department of Education was around.
I know, right? It's like we just assume it's always been there. But before it was created, education was mostly seen as a state and local issue. States had a lot more autonomy. They set their own curriculum standards, decided what qualifications teachers needed, and figured out how to, fund their schools.
So what changed? I mean, was there like specific event or something that pushed for this more centralized approach?
Well, the push for a federal Department of Education really picked up steam during the Civil Rights era, back in the 50s and 60s. You had that landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which basically said that segregating public schools based on race was unconstitutional.
Right.
And that ruling, it really highlighted how important it was to have federal oversight to ensure that all students had equal access to quality education, no matter their race.
That makes sense. So the Department of Education was created, at least in part, as a way to enforce those civil rights and make sure everyone had equal opportunities in education.
Exactly. And over the years, the department's role just kept expanding. It started handling things like federal funding for all those different education programs, overseeing student loans, conducting research, all sorts of things.
It really adds another layer to this whole debate when you think about the historical context, doesn't it? I mean, would getting rid of the department be like taking a step backward? Back to a time when education was more fragmented and potentially, more unequal.
That's a really valid point.
Hmm.
The people who want to abolish the department, they often say that going back to more local control would lead to more innovation, right? And schools would be more responsive to the specific needs of their communities. But the people who are against it, they worry that it could actually make things worse, widen the gap between, schools in wealthier districts that have plenty of resources and schools in poorer areas that are struggling to get by.
So it's a trade-off. More local control, but maybe at the risk of increasing inequality.
Right. And we have to remember that this debate isn't just happening in the U.S. You see countries all over the world struggling with the same questions, trying to figure out how to balance centralized control with local autonomy when it comes to education.
One of the things that really surprised me was just how much the Department of Education does. It's not just about, funding and civil rights. It's also about collecting data, doing research, and even providing training and support to teachers and schools. It's a lot.
It really is a massive operation. And that raises some practical questions. I mean, if the department were to disappear, who would do all of that? Would other agencies be able to handle it? Or would states have to step up and figure it out on their own? And would they even be able to? Those are questions that would need some serious thought.
And then there's that whole issue of the impact on, global education. We talked about this a bit earlier, but it's worth repeating. The U.S. Department of Education plays a big role in international education. Collaborations, student exchanges, things like that. Getting rid of it could send a message to other countries that the U.S. isn't as committed to global education anymore.
Right. The U.S. has always been a leader when it comes to education, and its influence reaches far beyond its own borders. Any major changes to the U.S. education system would be felt around the world.
It's crazy to think about all the possible consequences of this proposal. This has been a real deep dive, and we've uncovered so much complexity, so many potential ripple effects. But what makes this whole thing so fascinating, so important, is that it's not just some abstract policy debate. It's about real people. It's about students and their future.
Exactly. At the end of the day, this is about making sure that all students have the chance to succeed, to reach their full potential, regardless of where they come from or what their circumstances are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to admit I'm walking away with more questions than answers. But honestly, I think that's a good thing. It means we're thinking critically, right? And we're recognizing how crucial this debate is for the future of our country.
I agree completely. We need to keep talking about this,
Yeah.
and we need to make sure everyone has a voice in the conversation. Educators, parents, students, policymakers, everyone.
Because the future of education is something that affects all of us. It shapes the kind of society we create, and it deserves our full attention, our best efforts to ensure that every student has the opportunity to thrive.
Beautifully said. And to everyone listening, we want to leave you with this. What are your hopes for the future of education? If you could design the ideal system, what would it look like? We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep talking to each other about these crucial issues. The future of education, it's in all of our hands.